Hello, everyone. Before we start with the webinar, I just wanted to introduce myself. My name is Maria Agape with SK Ghost Associates, and I would like to welcome all of you to our today's webinar on Chapter 5, General Building Heights and Areas. Now, our speaker today is Mr. J. Elbatar. He will be presenting, and while he's presenting, you can post your questions in the Q&A box. So I don't know, a lot of you are probably not familiar with WebEx. So if you don't know where the Q&A box is, in the bottom right of the webinar WebEx screen, at bottom right, either you'll see an icon, a Q&A icon, or a question mark icon. Click on that and it'll pop up for you. And if you don't see that, then there's a three dotted icon in the bottom right. If you click on that, in the list should be a Q&A in there. Now, when you open up the Q&A box, then the very top of that, there's a drop-down menu. Now, when you post your question, make sure that menu is going to the host and the presenter. That's so we know both Jay and I can see the questions and we can have it posted and answered. Okay. And so also you should have received a PDF handout. Having a printed copy of that will facilitate your notes taking during the webinar. Now with that, Mr. Jay Elbatar, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Maria. Good morning, everyone. As Maria pointed out, we'll have Q&As at the end of the presentation. So please, if you can be patient, some of the questions will be addressed throughout the presentation. In addition, there might be some variation in the PowerPoint you see on the screen and the PDF you have, and they're purely editorial. This was a specific presentation that's designed specifically for you, Los Angeles Building and Safety folks, and addressing the LA Building Code. So it was customized. So I apologize if there's some typos, but I think we caught most of them or all of them. So with that, again, good morning, everyone, and I'll begin the presentation. So this is a little bit about me. I've been in the building and safety profession for over 40 years. I have a bachelor and master's in structural engineering. I'm a licensed engineer in 7 states. I'm also used to teach in Coastline Community College as an adjunct professor. I have many certifications, and I used to be the former vice chair of the Seismic Safety Commission appointed by Governor Schwarzenegger. I'm a Hall of Fame inductee for Calbo. I was a past president of the ICC and Calbo and Orange Empire chapter. I was the building official of the year for ICC in 2010, and I'm considered a code expert. I'm a former board member in the State of California Hospital Safety Board, and I'm currently an honorary member for ICC Calbo, Sacramento Valley chapter, and Orange Empire chapter. So that's a little bit about me, and I'm going to share my experience with you today, and hopefully I'll make your time worthwhile. So the goal of this seminar is to provide you with understanding of the general building heights and area and the 2019 CBC, and of course, along with the LA Building Code amendments, which is known to the 2020 City of Los Angeles Building Code. And throughout the presentation, I'll talk a little bit about the background and the reasons why some of the code provisions were made. I believe in order to be successful in this business, you have to strive to find out the why, the reasons why there's a code provisions. And the benefit of that is for you to always remember the requirements because you know the reasons. And second, it helps you to explain the rationale when you're challenged by members of the public. So I'll try again to share with you my knowledge of some of the provisions why they were introduced in the code and also some of the changes that were made by the state of California. Now, the changes made by LA City, they're minimal. However, you probably will be able to know why or figure that out yourself, why the city of Los Angeles made these changes. The objectives is for you to learn the relationship between building limitations and occupancy, classify the uses into occupancy groups where they fit, understand the various code approaches to mixed occupancies, including accessory occupancy. And you will see there are several approaches how to handle mixed occupancies. And then determine the type of construction of a proposed building, calculate the actual allowable building height and floor area, determine the modifiers for the allowable area increases, where the code allow you to increase the allowable areas, and then become familiar with the mezzanine provisions. At this point, I want to emphasize that it is very critical that you fix and understand the occupancy and type of construction for the building you're dealing with. If you have plans submitted by a design professional and the occupancy and type of construction are not shown or specified, then really you cannot do plan review or do an inspection, because most of the code requirements are driven by the type of construction and occupancy. So that's why it's, again, we emphasize that you have to understand the occupancy groups and the type of construction, and also all the modifiers and the increases allowed in the code, so you can make sure that the type of construction you're dealing with and the occupancy is the appropriate one. So this is an overview, basically, in general, what we're going to cover. We're going to talk about application of the LA Building Code. We'll talk a little bit about occupancy classification and use, which is in Chapter 5, then the types of construction, and then we'll talk about special detailed requirements based on use and occupancy. The code has in Chapter 4 special detailed requirements, and some of these are based on use. And you'll see that even though several uses may fall into one classification, so the code will talk about these special requirements. For example, if we have a special use, and we'll talk about that when we get to it, and you'll see that, like motor vehicle occupancies, related occupancies, for example. Um, we'll talk about general building heights and area. And again, the area increases that are permitted by the code for a specific situation or specific building. We'll talk a little bit briefly about fire and smoke protection features. They'll be covered in a different webinar in detail. And we'll talk about how to handle mixed occupancies. And as I said, there are several approaches to how to handle mixed occupancies. Because in reality, there is really no building you'll deal with that has purely one occupancy. There always will be mixed occupancies in a given building. So effective use of the LA building code, your building code has different requirements than other cities and the state building code. The state building code, of course, is the CBC, and it's mandated, and every jurisdiction has the right to make amendments. These amendments cannot be less restrictive. They have to be more restrictive, and they have to be justified based on topographical, geographical, climatic, and environmental conditions. So your code, chapter 1, has administrative provisions. Chapter 2 through 35 is the general provisions of the California Building Code are in your code. And of course, chapter 2 is definitions, and then the related requirement for life safety or non-structural will begin in 3 through 15. And then the structural or technical requirements will be chapter 16, and through 35 we'll have the standards, the reference standards. And chapter 61 through 72 is special requirements of the City of Los Angeles. Chapter 81 through 91 is code requirements for existing buildings. Chapter 92 through 96 is standards for voluntary and mandatory earthquake hazard reduction for existing buildings, including retrofitting and so forth. And Chapter 97 is standards for energy and water conservation for existing buildings and or water efficiency. So this is a recommendation. How do you approach the for a design professional or a plan reviewer? How do you approach um, the application of the building code or using the building code? So we talked a little bit about what's in the outline of your Los Angeles, or the content of the Los Angeles Building Code. Now, a recommendation is where to start, because if you start on the wrong foot, you'll be able to miss some of the requirements, or the building may not be designed properly, or you're not plan reviewing the building properly. as I mentioned earlier, the code requirements are derived based on the occupancy at type construction. And the reason being, we can't build all buildings the same way. You can't build a school similar to a parking garage. As we all know, the risk, for example, and especially for K through 12 and loss of life, is higher than a school than in a parking garage or a warehouse or a hospital versus an apartment building. So again, building classifications become very, very critical. We have to classify the building properly from the onset. You cannot even take a look at the project or start diving into it without specifying the right occupancy classification. That's not to say that most design professional will classify the building properly or even list the classifications on the plan. But again, you start out with building classification, the occupancy of the building, and then the type of construction. What type of construction we're dealing with? Is it a high risk occupancy? Most high risk occupancy will be an I1. And for example, if you have a hospital, the type of construction will be, say, type 1A. And the requirements for type 1A will be a lot more critical, for example, than the opposite side of the spectrum, which is type 5B, non-rated construction. So then you'll be able to pick the proper requirements in the code and apply them to the building. And the next thing you should do is to figure out or verify the allowable and actual area of the building and the height. Then try to pin down the fire protection systems required for the building. And the exiting means of egress. It's very critical to get people out. Fire, smoke, and protection features, then the interior finishes, and then the special detail requirement based on the use and occupancy, which will be which we'll cover today, and any other additional provisions. Now, some of these we will not cover because some other seminars, like on Chapter 7, will cover some of the fire resistive construction. We have another webinar coming up for Chapter 10, means of egress, and another webinar on Chapter 9 for fire protection systems. But this is just an outline on how you use the code properly, again, for a design professional and a regulator such as yourself. Now we move into occupancy classifications. So occupancy classifications basically are uses grouped with each other based on life safety characteristics of the use, combustible content, and fire hazards. And we group them into occupancies, and then we base the code requirements on for each occupancy differently. Because like I said earlier, the risk, for example, in a school, an E occupancy is not the same, for example, for a factory, an F1, or a hazardous occupancy, an H1. So we can't apply the same code requirements for every building. It is not realistic and of course not cost effective. So we classify the building and the prop based on the use, based on the life safety characteristics, the content of the building, and the hazard and the risk. And then we start applying the proper code requirements to the building. Um, so again, to basically to achieve this equivalent safety in building design across the board, the occupancy groups, they vary by the type of construction restrictions on the building, whether it's required to have sprinkler systems or smoke alarm, fire and smoke alarm, and so forth, fire protection requirements, the location of the building on the property, and that's called the fire separation distance between an adjacent building or a property line, and the area and height limitations, and exiting, which is what we call means of egress. So what is the related hazards in occupancy classifications? And why do we, for example, call an occupancy A1 and another occupancy A2? Why do we call an occupancy B? And again, it's depending on the hazards. the number of occupants in the building or the space, the density of the occupants, and the age of the occupants, um, and mobility of the occupants, and awareness of the occupants. So, for example, if you have occupants that has mobility impairment, they are they will not be able to exit on their own self by their own self, what we call in the code language, they're not capable of self-preservation, then the occupancy become a little bit more restrictive type occupancy. Also, the awareness of the occupants, if they're mentally aware versus they have certain disabilities. So that's how we classify the occupancies based on some of these hazards. So let me go back to the other slide. This was occupant related hazards related to the number of occupants, as we discussed already, and so forth. And this one is these factors are content related hazards. So depending on the density of the contents, the quantity of the contents, for example, when we have hazardous contents, there's a table in the code that has maximum quantities. If you exceed those maximum quantities, the occupancy will revert to hazardous occupancy. The type of contents, are they combustible? Are they health hazard? Do they present health hazards? The environment of the contents, the flammability of the contents. So these will play a big role into how do we classify occupancies. So again, there were content related occupants hazards and occupant related hazards. These two hazards play a big role in how we classify occupancies, and we'll see that. So this is the occupancy classifications. So for those of you who are, well, I'm sure all of you have some level of familiarity with the code, but to make it easy when you explain, these occupancies are listed alphabetically in general, except some with very few exceptions. And the occupancy type signify the first letter of the use or the occupancy itself. So A for assembly, B for business, E for educational, and so forth. And then here there are a group M for mercantile, group R for residential, group S for storage, and then the state fire marshal added in the CBC and in the LA building code, of course, L for laboratories and C for organized camps. You don't find, or you won't find these occupancies in the IBC. These are state-specific occupancies added by the state fire marshal. The laboratory group L was added for building containing one or more laboratory suites, and the provisions for this occupancy are optional and may apply to building structures based on the authority having jurisdictions. And then it would require a report to identify and develop methods of protection from hazards that are presented by the lab. So, and the report is required, for example, by the city of Los Angeles from a qualified person approved by the city and prepare their opinion and report. And if then the city can qualify or classify the lab as a group L occupancy and apply the code requirement that are specifically related to group L occupancy. Organized camps, group C, is another, again, state fire marshal occupancy. It's not in the IBC. It's for an organized camps on a site with programs and facilities that has the primary purpose to try to provide outdoor living experience with social, spiritual, and other recreational objectives for 5 days or more. So if it's less than 5 days, we don't classify it as group C occupancy. So each occupancy classification will have some of those here listed, has sub-classification within the same group. So for group occupancy, we have A1, A2, A3, A4, and A5. And in general, as the number goes down or increases, the level of hazard is lower. So an A5 occupancy will be a lot less risk in terms of loss of life and rather than A1. And A1, for example, is a viewing, performing arts, or motion pictures. So it could be in a theater, a movie theater, or a cinema. Whereas A5 is an outdoor facility, such as a football stadium, an outdoor swimming pool with spectator seating. Group A4 is indoor sporting events, like an indoor arena, basketball arena, or others. Group A3 is worship, recreation, or amusements, and other uses not in A2. A2 is food or drink consumptions, basically restaurants and nightclubs and so forth. So this is the assembly group, Group A. Group B is business occupancies, and that basically is when you have using the building or any portion of the building, room or spaces, for professional or service types transactions. Um, for example, a bank, an insurance office, an office building, LA Department of Building Safety. It would be a business occupancy. Educational group is E, and that basically includes the occupancy of 6 or more persons at any one time for educational purposes through the 12th grade. Um, it also includes, and most people miss that, the assembly areas associated with Group E. They can be classified as part of Group E. So they're not Group A, and that's basically like a school auditorium. If you have a school auditorium, you don't classify that as a school group, assembly Group A. It will be part of the Group E occupancy. And that's significant because if you classify it as assembly Group A, and the main occupancy is Group E, then you have to address occupancy separation approach. Whereas the code allows you, as long as it's part of the main use, school auditorium, then it will be part of Group E. So it will be classified as Group E. Then Group F is for factory, and it has F1 and F2. And as we discussed, as the number goes, the subgroup goes up, the hazard is less. So F1 is moderate hazard, and F2 is low hazard. So basically, manufacturing of non-combustible materials will be in F2. Manufacturing of combustible materials will be F1. And high hazard is Group H, and Group H involve any use of building for manufacturing, generating, or storage of materials that has physical or health hazard in quantities that are exceeding that allowed in the code, or in control areas. And we'll talk a little bit about control areas. And these are all specified in the code in section 414, which is the detailed requirement, special detailed requirement for occupancy, and we'll get to that. So the maximum allowable quantities, or MAQ, are very critical to know and understand, because once you exceed that, you will be classified in Group H. And that's why many, for example, building supply warehouses, such as, say, Home Depot or Lowe's, they will have only specified amounts on display on the shelves. And they cannot exceed those maximum quantities. Otherwise, instead of being mercantile occupancy, they will end up being an H occupancy. So they'll store the extra supplies that will exceed the MAQs in a control area, in a fire control area somewhere else. It could be outside the store, or it could be in a mixed occupancy in the store itself, but controlled fire control area. And when they run out of supplies on the shelf, they'll bring more. But they're restricted to the maximum allowable quantity, so they can remain a mercantile occupancy. So H1, for example, is building a structure that contains materials that present detonation hazard. They're H1. And I'm going to go all the way to H5, so you can see the difference. And all these are, um, again, listed in the code in detail. So Group H5 includes semiconductors, fabrication facilities, like microchips and so forth, research and development, where the hazardous material production are used and quantities again exceeded the MAQs. So as you can see, H1 has detonation, whereas H5 has semiconductor business. So the level of hazard is a lot higher in H1 occupancy than H5 occupancy. So here are some examples. So we have an insurance office. What do we classify that as? In the insurance office, it will be Group B occupancy. Here we have a steel fabrication plant. It will be, again, fabrication of steel involve low hazard material, non-combustible, so it's Group F2. Convenience store will deal with merchandise, selling supplies and so forth, so it'll be Group M for mercantile. So this is generally, again, we have another example, multiplex theater. Um, then again, that will be where people come in and view performances. It's an assembly, and it will be A1 occupancy. These are a few examples to illustrate the concept of occupancy classifications. One thing to remember, if your occupancy that you're dealing with is not specifically listed in the code, then you would classify it based on the occupancy that most resemble the use that you have and you're dealing with. The code allows you to do that. Basically, you're operating under the authority of the building official. The building official is the person who is entrusted in the code in classifying occupancies. Now we move on to type of construction. Um, there are type of constructions. We have basically 5 main types of construction, and we have subtypes of construction. So all buildings, if they're constructed, altered, or expanded in height or area, they must be classified in one of the construction types. You cannot, again, deal with the building, whether somebody wants to add on or do main alterations or so forth, without pinning down the type of construction. And that's where your records for building departments come into play. If you have an existing building, then you'll be able to go back and look at the record and figure out the type of construction you're dealing with. If, for example, the type of construction is existing non-conforming, then you'll have to deal with it in another way. And that will be discussed more in Chapter 7 webinar. And basically, we'll put a firewall to separate the two buildings. So there'll be 2 different types of constructions. So we have construction type 1 and 2, construction type 3, construction type 4, and construction type 5. And again, this goes back to the same concept I talked about earlier. We can all go out and build every building in the country of type 1 and call it a day. There's no risk, no fire. But is that affordable? Type 1 is the highest type of construction that contains non-combustibility, um, uh, non-combustible elements, and has a lot of restrictions in terms of the type of construction. However, when the code imposes restrictions, it allows you to build in large area or height, because the type of construction is the most fire resistive type, the most type of construction that is will allow for the building to perform at a high level and lower risk. So what would you say a high-rise building would be mostly built of? What construction type? It would be construction type 1 because we have an unlimited height. So at this point, the code give and the code takes. So the code is restricting you by using type construction 1 and want to keep the purity of that type construction and then allow you to go as high as you want. So that's the concept of how the relationship between the risk and the type of construction used. So do we say, let's build everything type 1 and not have any loss of life risk associated with fire? So can we build single family dwelling of type 1 construction? The answer is no. It becomes unaffordable and not realistic. So again, the type of constructions we're dealing with is they contain, going back to the risk, combustibles or non-combustibles. So you can see type 1, B and A will, for non-combustible material, can be only included and permitted into interior bearing or non-bearing walls, floors, roofs, and structural elements to be of non-combustible material. So you cannot have combustible material in type 1BA, type 2A, and type 2B. So these are the structural elements. Whereas for type 3A, type 3B, type 4, 5A, and 5B, which we all know 5B is non-rated construction, you can have combustible material or non-combustible material of exterior walls for those type of construction. Whereas for type the other types 1 and 2, you cannot have combustible materials. So this is an example. There's a footnote in 601, and we'll go through these to illustrate the point. There is a footnote in table 601 that talks about the type of construction. And that footnote relates to fire protection of roof structural members, including structural frame, is not required when the height exceeds 20 feet. The state fire marshal, however, and we'll talk a little bit more about this when we get to the areas, made an exception to fire marshal regulated occupancies, state fire marshal regulated occupancies. And those occupancies are group A, E, F1, H, I, L, and R occupancies. So these are regulated occupancies with state fire marshal, and you will see throughout that there are special provisions or special exceptions in the code that deal with these occupancies. And it goes back to when the first introduction of the International Building Code was introduced in the state of California and considered for adoption versus the Uniform Building Code. The building industry professionals, including the fire service, felt that the IBC was very generous in allowing heights and areas. So the state fire marshal made certain exceptions, and we'll talk about it in detail. So here again, fire protection of roof and structural members, including structural frame and decking, is not required when the height is 20 feet. And it's thought that because of the height, if there is a fire at the floor level, it will not affect the structural member because 20 feet is too high. So for example, here, type 1A, we'll talk about the type of construction in relationship to the table. The roof has to be rated 1.5 hours, and we'll see a table shortly. And the floor ceiling is 2 hours. The non-bearing partition is non-rated. The exterior bearing walls are 3 hours. The structural frame or interior bearing walls is 3 hours. And these are all listed in table 601 and 602. I'm going to jump to the table and then come back to here. So this is the table, and you can see in the table here, there is the primary structural member, for example, and then the type of construction. And based on the type of construction, you have the required rating. For bearing walls, the type of construction, if it's exterior bearing walls, type 1A, the rating required is 3 hours. For type 1B is 2 hours. For type 5B, right here, type 5B, if we go down, you see the rating is 0 hours. For non-bearing walls interior, then it's all non-rated. You can see 0 across the board right here, all 0. So we'll go back to the examples, and these examples are based on this table. And let's not forget the footnotes. The footnotes are critical. You can see footnotes everywhere. And we discussed footnote B earlier in terms of the 20 feet minimum height. So the assembly doesn't have to be rated. So here we go. Now I have to erase these. Okay. So type 1A is, again, the roof has to be 1.5 hour, and all these elements of the building are basically based on table 601 that we looked at. For type 1B, you can see a little bit of a reduction. So the roof is 1 hour, whereas in 1A was 1.5 hours, and so forth. The exterior bearing walls here is 2 hours, whereas in 1A it was 3 hours right here. So as we go down to different type construction, the rating of the elements will be less required. It's type 2A again, and type 2B. Now the roof is non-rated in type 2B. So you can see here the roof is not rated. Type 3A, the roof is 1 hour because, and I think at this point in time, I want to signify that A stands for rated and B is non-rated. And in the past, it used to be type 3, rated R, and type 3 N, which is non-rated. So it's changed to type 3A and type 3B. And in order to remember, at least type 3B is burn. So you can remember it's type 3B is non-rated. So that's why type 3B, or let's go back, type 2B is non-rated burn, the roof is non-rated, and the exterior bearing walls is non-rated, and the floor ceiling is non-rated. Everything else here is non-rated because it's type 2B non-rated. Again, this is the table we discussed. It provides the basic fire resistant rating requirements for all types of construction. And so basically, it also identifies the fire resistant rating required to qualify for a type of construction. So once you say that you're going to do type 1A, then you have to, all the elements must follow this table. And that's where I went back and says, if we do 1A for a high-rise building, the code now is allowing you to go with unlimited height, and we'll talk about heights shortly, but it restricts you to have a primary structural frame that has 3 hours, and exterior 3 hour, bearing walls are 3 hours, and the interior bearing walls are 3 hours. Whereas if you cannot build a type 5B high-rise building or unlimited height because it's unrated. These elements are not rated. If you have a fire, you have a high risk loss of life or building collapse. These are the footnotes for table 601A. And here I want to point out that in footnote 1 is this is the fire marshal changes, and it talks about high-rise buildings. Let me see if I can use the annotate feature. One of you asked to use it. So we're here. Oops. Doesn't seem to work for me very well. So okay, so it doesn't work for me very well. So the first paragraph, it talks about roof supports, fire resistant rating for primary structural member bearing walls are permitted to be reduced 1 hour or supporting a roof only. So the code allows you to reduce the rating when you're supporting a roof only by 1 hour, but the fire marshal says except in these occupancies, high-rise building, it says that you don't have to reduce, the fire protection is not required when they're 20 feet distance. This is the picture we looked at, if there's a minimum 20 feet height separation. For these group of occupancies, A, E, I, L, R1, R2, and R2.1, high-rise buildings also, again, where every part of construction is, so it again allows that you do not have to rate the buildings. And the fire marshal here is a little bit more permissive than the IBC, just in this instance, because they are restricting some of the requirements later. And the restrictions is that you cannot basically double dip, it's called, where the code allows you, when we go to the area increases and height, if you use, for example, sprinkler system, you are allowed to increase the area and height. The fire marshal says you cannot do both. You can do one or the other. If you increase the allowable area, you cannot increase the height, and or vice versa. And we'll see that when we get into the area, the allowable areas provisions. This will be covered again in the chapter related to Chapter 7, Fire Resistive Construction, in a lot more detail. So this is type 3B, again, non-rated. So all the elements are non-rated because it's type 3B, except the exterior bearing walls is 2 hours. And when you see this type of provision, it will translate to a different allowable area. If you keep a mental memory of this when we get to the allowable area table, you will see that type 3B has a different allowable area than type 3A, for example, or than type 2B, for example. As if you recall type 2B earlier, we show that nothing is rated in here, and also the height. So all these things relate to each other. When the type of construction for the elements are not rated, you'll see that the allowable area is limited in size. Type 4 is heavy timber, and generally nothing is rated except the interior bearing walls, 1 hour heavy timber, and the exterior bearing walls are 2 hours. The idea of heavy timber is, again, it's defined in the code of minimum sizes of wood members. These wood members are large in size, so when there is a fire, they'll char on the exterior, but they'll maintain their bearing or strength to hold the building. So that's why type 4 is different than type 5 non-rated. Type 5 non-rated would use any type of lumber, whereas type 4, you're restricted to large sizes as defined in the code. And these members have to be solid. They cannot be, say, for example, built up joists like TJI or so forth. They have to be solid wood members or laminated wood and without any concealed spaces, any hollow spaces. This is type 5A. We have 1 hour for the roof, 1 hour for the wall, 1 hour for the floor ceiling assembly. Non-bearing partitions are not rated, but bearing or structural frame is 1 hour. And when you're bearing and you're holding the building, then the type 5A require you to rate it. And you don't see 2-hour rating here. So type 5A is always, the maximum amount of rating is 1 hour. In general, unless there's a specific hazardous occupancy or a fire control area or so forth, then we revert to other requirements. But in general, type 5A, the highest rating required is 1 hour. . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . Type 5B, nothing is rated into this type of construction, and most commonly, this is the type that's used for single-family dwelling, but not apartments or apartment buildings exceeding the height, or if a single-family dwelling exceeding the allowed height in the table, then you cannot use Type 5B. You'll have to go to a higher type construction. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So now we take a look at the requirement for fire separation distance, which is contained in Table 602. This table regulates the exterior walls only. It doesn't regulate anything else and must be used in concert with 601. So you must always look at the requirement in 601 where for the exterior walls, the rating of the exterior walls. And the worst of those two tables will apply. So on the left side, you see if the fire separation distance is, for example, less than 5 feet, and for all types of construction, occupancy group H and L, and if the distance between the exterior wall and the next building or the property line, the rating must be 3 hours. For occupancy group F1, M, and S1, 2 hours. For the remaining occupancies is 1 hour. So this illustrates the point of how the code requirements are driven by the type of construction, which is in this case the rating of how many hours needed, and the occupancy. So you can see that. You can go down the table, and if you go to the bottom, when the fire separation distance is more than equal or more than 30 feet for all occupancies, no rating is required. The theory behind it, you're so far from the property line or the adjacent building that there is no hazard will occur in fire in the building that could transfer to the next door building. And some other factors, including firefighting capability and access around the building. So again, it's critical to understand the rationale behind this table so you can apply it correctly. There are additional criteria required for exterior walls. They're found in section 704.10 and 705, and that will be covered in chapter 7 webinar. So here is combustible materials. When can we use combustible materials? And we talked a little bit about that briefly in that table earlier. But in type 1 and type 2 constructions, there are certain areas where you can use combustible materials. You can use fire retardant treated wood for non-bearing partitions of 2 hours or less. You can use non-bearing exterior walls where the rating is not required. You can also use it in balconies, porches, decks, and exterior stairways, not used as required exits. Maybe typo here, I apologize. Thermal and acoustical insulation with limited flame spread, foam plastics in accordance with chapter 26, class A, roof covering, class B or C, and interior floor finish like trim, mill walls, work, things and stuff. And I was holding him to the non-combustible requirement. It was in a high-rise building, and I was accurate in the tiki flammable stuff roof, but I also applied it to the millwork, the trim, and others, and door frames. And I learned quickly that that was not correct application. I was basically over enforcing the code. But in the roof covering of those bars, I was correct. So they had to come up with more like non-flammable, non-combustible, look-alike tiki covering for the bars. So again, more in platforms in accordance with section 410, blocking for handrails, cabinets, fixtures. So if you have like say handrails, disabled access handrails in the bathroom and you need to put blocking for anchorage purposes, then you're allowed to use combustible materials like 4x4 or 2x4, light transmitting plastic in accordance with Chapter 26, and that's, of course, combustible. Nailing or furring strips in accordance with Section 803.15. Chapter 8 is interior environment, deals with flammable interior, flammable roof covering, and so forth. Heavy timber construction for specific components is allowed, and other additional applications. Also, combustible exterior wall coverings and similar projections, and bay windows and oriel windows in accordance with Chapter 14 and Section 705.2.3.1. So we're going to skip the break. If we need a break, we'll take a break, but I'm going to keep plowing through because we have a lot of material to cover. Chapter 7 webinar, I want to emphasize the significance of Chapter 7. Chapter 7 is the largest chapter in the code that deals with fire resistive construction and non-structural requirement. And it's very important that all references and specific requirements and how to build a fire barrier, a smoke barrier, a firewall, occupancy separations, shaft protection, all these things are specified in Chapter 7. So again, I wouldn't miss that webinar. Now we'll talk about special detailed requirements for use and occupancies, and then we'll go back to the allowable heights and areas, and then we'll conclude. So there are, in the past, for those of you who are familiar with the UBC, the occupancy will be listed and the requirement for that occupancy will be contained in the same area, the same section. Well, the IBC approach is to list the occupancy classification in Chapter 3, and then in Chapter 4, the detailed requirements. And the reason being because there are several uses that are in a specific occupancy, but their use dictates some changes. For example, a covered mall building here is considered mercantile, whereas motor vehicle related occupancy that has a like a gas station or a mini mart could be considered mercantile, but the requirement, depending on how it's built, but the requirement for a gas station is a little bit different than a covered mall. So that's why this Chapter 4 contained the specific requirement identified based on use, not just specifically occupancy. So a building used as a cover mall, an open mall building, that's how it's used, but it's mercantile occupancy. So Section 402 talks about covered mall and open mall building, and I'm going to just basically um, summarize some of the requirements and go those very quickly. There are many of them, just so you know they're there, and you can dive into it if you're working, reviewing a project or doing inspection on a project, covered mall. Just be aware there's a specific section that talks about covered mall in the code. And this is building and structures defined in 202, section 202, covered or open mall building. They're not exceeding 3 floors or at any point, nor more than 3 stories above grade plane. Um, so there are certain things you need to know. Anchor buildings are not considered, although they're physically attached to the mall, they're not considered part of this provision. Anchor buildings could be 3 stories. They'll be like the Nordstroms, the Macy's, and they will be constructed in a way with firewall to separate them from the mall. So the mall requirements apply to the mall itself. The anchor buildings are at the ends of each mall. They're different. They're just basically regular buildings. And high-rise buildings, these are buildings with the occupied floor located more than 75 feet above the lowest level of the fire department vehicle access. And the reason this is, and this is limited to 75 feet. And the reason being because most of the engine companies, the ladder trucks, cannot reach more than 75 feet. So now the code define these buildings as such and impose very restrictive requirement on them, such as pressurized stairwells and so forth. And of course, the type of construction will be very restrictive type of construction because they're tall buildings and it's difficult to provide rescue and emergency response to all floors of these buildings. Underground buildings and atriums for, I skipped atrium, so talk a little bit about atriums. That's a little bit of a challenge too. It's a vertical opening connecting two or more stories. And that's a little bit of a situation where um, the code address the risk because you have a large opening where smoke can travel and so forth. They're more discussed in detail in section 712.1.6. That's again chapter 7. So what commonly you see atriums in malls, you see them in a type of hotel like the Embassy Suites, you see them in office buildings at the entry lobby and so forth. Underground buildings, these are buildings that having floor level use for human occupancy located more than 30 feet below the finished floor of the lowest level of the exit discharge. And they have to have special fire protection features. Again, they're below grade, 30 feet below, so there is a risk involved. Motor vehicle rated occupancy, um, they're such as private garages, carports, public parking garages, and there are subsections of 406. So each one of those uses I talked about has a specific section. Enclosed parking garages are 406.6, open parking garages are 406.5. Motor vehicle dispensing facilities are 406.7, and so forth. So when you're dealing with motor vehicle rated occupancy, be sure to look at 406 and pick the proper use and check if there are any detailed requirements, special requirements related to that use. Then 407 deals with group I2, hospital and nursing homes. Group I 2.1, for example, the corridors must be continuous to the exits and must be constructed as smoke partition, sprinklers required, um, also automatic fire detection system and fire alarms are required, again, because of the risk of these occupancies in use. A group I3 is jails, and again, the challenge with these facilities is exiting. We can't let those inmates out easily. However, we have to make sure their life safety is ensured. And so there are specific requirements in 408 related to um, these occupancies. 409 are projection rooms for motion pictures. 410 related to stages. Stages are spaces utilized for entertainment or presentation, and they include overhead hanging curtains and drops or scenery, stage effects. The storage area is also include um, other components, storing some equipment and backdrops and other things, and so forth. And some of you may be familiar with the Ericos Theater fire in Chicago, where many individuals died, over 600 individuals, because of the fire in the proscenium and the curtains that caught fire at the time it was not rated. There are now special requirements for rating stages and platforms and motion pictures and so forth. And again, we get into 410, and it's the same thing. More, this is live performance, scenery, props, and so forth. Special amusement buildings. At this point in time, I'll talk about the fire marshal introduced a new use in the 2021 or 2022 California Building Code, and it's called puzzle rooms. And this related to amusement facilities that are commonly known as escape rooms these days. So escape rooms, generally individuals are in a room trying to figure out clues so they can get out of the room. The room will open once they figure out the clues. So You can you possibly agree that in this case, exiting becomes a challenge. And of course, the lighting conditions. Aircraft related occupancies, also, these are more like air traffic control towers, aircraft hangars. There's now also, we've seen in some of the affluent residential facilities, they have residential aircraft hangars, heliports, and so forth. Combustible storage, 413, um, unless protected by sprinkler systems, attic, underfloor, and concealed spaces must be protected on the storage side by 1 hour construction to protect against a fire. If you have a fire in these areas, and again, it will, if it's not sprinklered, you must separate with more passive fire protection. Again, this will be discussed more in Chapter 7, the difference between passive fire protection and active fire protection, where passive is using construction elements and components such as drywall, fire-resistant rated assemblies, doors and windows, and so forth, versus fire alarm and fire extinguishing systems and smoke control systems. And hazardous material is another, again, there are special requirements dealing with hazardous material. And these are building structures where they manufacture, process, store, use, sell, dispense these hazardous material that exceeds the quantities listed in the code. There are specific requirements for to contain these hazards, and there should be the fire code have specific requirement either. There should be separate floor plans indicating the nature of each of these rooms and the location of the material, hazardous material being stored or used, and the protection of those hazards has to be submitted to the building official, um, and to address how these hazardous material is contained. 415 talks in detail about all these occupancies, H1 through H5. Um, 416 talks about spray application of flammable materials, um, flammable finishes, and this is very critical in car auto body shops or boats where you have spray booth. You basically apply flammable paints, varnishes, and so forth. So they must comply with the specific requirements in the building and fire code. Drying rooms or dry kiln, also these are considered special use, and they must be constructed of non-combustible materials or assemblies. Organic coating, these are coatings where um, they're used from plant material or animal material, and they should be done. They should not have pits or basements, and they should not be located in a building having other occupancies. You can see some of these special requirements are very, very critical to understand and apply. As if you have organic coatings, it's very clear, it says Section 418 says such operations shall not be located in buildings having other occupancies. So you cannot have it in the same building where you have, say, um, a B occupancy or a mercantile occupancy or any other occupancy. 419 is live work units. This is to address dwelling units with sleeping units, but also contain a large amount of non-residential use. So it becomes a mixed occupancy condition. So a single classification of group R2 is possible if the live work unit is limited to those units where the non-residential use is operated by the same tenant who owns the building, who live there and work there. For example, barber, beauty shop, small mom and pop restaurant where they live upstairs, art galleries, insurance office, and so forth. There is some limitations on the non-residential portion and also the number of workers and there is an exception allowed when the office area is less than 10%. It has to be less than 10% of their dwelling unit. And that's, we're going to talk about incidental occupancies later, or accessory occupancies. Actually, accessory occupancy is defined as an occupancy when it's less than 10%. When it's less than 10%, then you don't have to provide any separation. So it's similar here. When it's the non-residential use should be less than 10% of the area of the dwelling units. These group of occupancy in section 420, I1, R1, R2, R2.1, R2.2, R3, R3.1, and R4. When you see 2.1 and 2.2 and 3.1, these are California specific occupancy. There are some requirements in here. Basically addresses building wall separation, sleeping units from other occupancies, and they'll be discussed in detail in section 708 as fire partitions and fire barriers, and also the horizontal assemblies, which is floor ceiling assemblies, must be constructed in and addressed in section 711. So again, chapter 7 will address the fire resistive construction for these separation in these occupancies. I'll go quickly through these. We're almost done with the special detail requirement. Hydrogen, fuel gas rooms. Um, these are rooms or spaces. They're exclusively storing or housing a gaseous hydrogen system. They're regulated for their location, separation, and ventilation. There's also gas detection requirement, explosion control, and standby power. Ambulatory health care facility, there are group B occupancies where individuals are ambular, they are capable of their own self-preservation and they can move around. These are health facilities providing medical, surgical, psychiatric, nursing, or similar care, but less than 24 hours. So, like a dental surgery clinic or outpatient surgery center would fall into this category. There are special requirements requiring smoke compartmentation when the floor area exceeds 10,000 square feet, and there are other requirements for fire separation and so forth. Oops. Storm shelters, again, well, they're provided, storm shelters must comply with ICC 500, and they have to have two, there must be provided two facilities, type of facilities, critical emergency operation facilities, similar to 911 call station, emergency operations centers, and these are located in every jurisdiction, commonly known abbreviation EOC, fire rescue ambulance and police stations, and Group E educational occupancy other than daycare facilities where the occupant load is 50 or more. Um, Storm shelters are only required in areas where the shelter design wind speed for tornadoes is 250 miles an hour or more. Children play structures, again, normally because there's flammable and combustible materials found in these play structures, they are regulated. If the structures are indoor, such as indoor play gyms and so forth, that you can find them these days, if it exceeds 10 feet in height and is more than 150 square feet, they must be separated from the building walls, partitions, and means of egress, and other play structures. Hyperbaric facilities, these are facilities for medical treatment. The gaseous pressure greater than normal is utilized. They administer oxygen, and there are special requirements for those facilities to minimize the hazard of explosion and electricity. Combustible dust, such as working shops, woodworking facilities, is highly combustible, where that dust is stored or handled. So there are special requirements again in terms of the building height, a maximum area required, and so forth. Also, grain silos, they're also considered, part of this group too, or use. Med gas systems, or any gas systems used for healthcare related facilities to help patients or veterinary care must comply with special requirements, subsections within 427 and the fire code. There are requirements for storage, containers where they're stored, and the quantities cannot be permitted more than um, certain requirements, other certain amounts, and then otherwise they have to be located in 1 hour exterior room or 1 hour interior room or gas cabinets constructed as specified in the code. These, I'm going really fast through these, but like section 427 will have many subsections and list the requirements. So forgive me if I'm going fast. There's a lot to cover. I just want to make you aware that these special requirements exist, and and that you know where to go to apply them. Special provisions for licensed 24-hour care facilities. These are, again, there are special requirements and related to individuals who are, um, you know, um, housed in these facilities. Some facility in these occupancies restraints are not allowed, so you cannot restrain the patient or the resident in these facilities. If you do, there will be classified as a different occupancy and an I occupancy, where there's a lot more restrictions. Um, and these are a group of occupancy that must be licensed. And incidentally, here, when we say 24-hour care facilities, the 2022 California Building Code will try to um, use child care facility in case of child care versus daycare. So they don't use the definition of daycare for anymore because of inconsistent with the social services definition. Group I4, here we go, child care facilities. These are, the requirements should not be located above or below the first story, with some exceptions related to the use of sprinkler system or exiting. Road, tunnels, and bridges, this is a State Fire Marshal addition in the code. We don't really deal with those. Horse racing stables, a requirement for sprinkler system and fire alarm apply to each building, barn, and so forth. And this related to um, regulations by the California Horse Racing Board for the stabling of horses or human habitation. Again, this is State Fire Marshal added all these occupancies, pet kennels, uses, pet kennels, pet boarding facilities, combustion engine and gas turbines, fixed gasway, fixed guideway transit and passenger rail system. And this doesn't apply to the actual machinery or the rail itself. It applies to the buildings only that are defined as stations for passengers or so forth. And these specific requirements in this section 443 will supersede general requirements elsewhere in the code. Winery caves is the use of subterranean spaces for winery facilities um, in natural or man-made caves. Some of these, they're based on, the requirements based on public access, specific building regulation, public tours, and standby personnel. Um, Here, if you can see, like we go from section 443 to section 446. So section 444, 445 are basically reserved or not used. So I'm not really jumping sections, it's just they're not used. Public libraries apply to public libraries funded by the California Public Construction and Innovation Act, deals with installation of sprinkler system, exiting, um, and it applies to new facilities in addition. And it also deals with the location of sprinkler system, such as book return slots, where you have book return slots and so forth. We talked about Group C, organized camps, um, and school facilities for kindergarten through 12th grade, and Group E, daycare facilities. Again, this will change to childcare. Group L is maximum area of each individual lab not to exceed 10,000 feet occupancy, and I think it's up to the jurisdiction based on a report to classify these uses as Group L, and the requirements deal with occupancy separation, fire and smoke barriers, emergency response, equipment area, liquid tight floor, emergency power, ventilation, exiting, hazardous materials, and so forth. And lastly, the last detailed occupancy is for large family daycare home. These are permitted by state law. It preempts local jurisdictions from um, prohibiting them. There are requirements for smoke alarm, fire extinguisher system, special hazards such as the use of gas-fired water heaters or furnaces or so forth. Um, again, this is fire marshal state occupancies. Now, 455 is the last section in the 2022 CBC. The fire marshal added another use and regulated that use. And don't ask me why. It's an outdoor use, inflatable amusement devices that relates to jump houses. So there will be requirements in the 2022 CBC regulating jump houses, inflatable jump houses. So now we're going to move, now that we're familiar with the occupancies, the special detailed requirements, we'll talk in depth about the allowable heights and areas, how to handle the mixed occupancies in the building, the increases in allowable area and the increases in heights as it relates to the occupancy and type of construction. So essential ingredients actually in determining the code requirements is to figure out the allowable area. And how do you determine the allowable area is basically it's based on the type and amount of combustibles due to the use of the building, the amount of combustibles in the component used to construct the building, and features used such as sprinkler system, open space around the building, and firewalls. The purpose of this chapter actually is to control the height and area of buildings based on the occupancy classification. For example, a parking structure, the level of risk and loss is a lot less than, like I said earlier, a hospital. So the allowable area for the occupancy of a parking structure, which could be S1, storage occupancy, will be a lot more permissive than an I occupancy. And then there are other factors apply, such as these factors. What do we use in the building? What type of construction is the building? Now, if it's an apartment building, if we use type 5A versus type 5N and so forth. So, and, and again, like the amount of combustibles in the building itself. So we'll get to see how that works and how the rationale and how the table is used. Some restrictions in the area limitations, the restriction of maximum building area are basically intended to limit the size of the fire that potentially may develop. And that, again, we have to consider the hazard, um, not only the damage to the property itself, but the spread of fire to the adjacent buildings. When there were the riots in Los Angeles in the 1990s, you could see actually the firefighters will be on top of one building and they're hiding behind a parapet and they're spraying the fire on the building next door. Because if they don't, and absent a parapet, which is required by the code to allow for firefighter operation, then the spread of fire will be easily spreading from one building to the other. So, a building with high hazard, we limit the area, we limit how the building is built. So we can limit the size, limit the height associated with the risk versus another building Like I said, keep going back to parking structure built out of non-combustible materials, mostly concrete, masonry walls. Um, so in most cases, we allow them to be unlimited. There's other considerations. Life safety must be considered in relationship to the number of occupants. A theater containing, allowing, say, more than 2,000 individuals. So we must limit the area as it relates to the type of construction. We can construct a theater that allows 2,000 individuals or occupants at the time of type 5N. Obviously, that would be a huge risk, and the risk of loss of life, the spread of fire, the difficulty of firefighting, and emergency response and rescue. Which is the next bullet point. Firefighting accessibility and fire department personnel is a huge factor. And that's why you see most of these unlimited area buildings, such as a Costco or a Home Depot, you see open space all around the building. And that open space allow the fire department access to fight fire from all around the building. So when we talk about unlimited area buildings and we talk about the allowable area increases due to frontage, that will become much clearer. When you have a huge frontage that's facing a public right of way, then the code allows you to increase the area of the building. So to determine um, the allowable area, the building of a given building, you must determine the allowable area factor based on the occupancy classification, type of construction, and whether the building is sprinklered or not. And that's all shown in table 506.2, which we will see shortly. So first, when you get to that table, you're basically picking up an allowable area factor, or what I would call it, the pure number. It's unmodified. That's the number you start with. And that number, once you pick that number, and again, driven by occupancy and type construction, I'm going to make you sick of that statement because I keep repeating it, as I've seen throughout my career permits issued without occupancy and type construction specified. That's when as a building official, I intervene and express my displeasure. So anyway, so you pick that number and then you start applying code permitted increases as warranted. So you look at any allowable area increases permitted by the code. The first one is the allowable area increase based on the building location on the lot. And that's addressed in section 506.3. And the rationale behind that, again, if the building located in the center of the lot with vast distances separating it from the property line or other buildings, the code will allow you an increase in the allowable area factor that you picked, or the pure number that you picked from the table. That's called the frontage increase. So we'll see a graphic presentation of that shortly. But before we do, we have to figure out, and this has been debatable for many fire and building officials, and most people overlook it, what area you're looking at. The area you're looking at of a building or structure is only the area per story. And that area is the pure number that you pick from table 506.2. And it's the area surrounded by the exterior walls. So it's from the inside of the wall to the inside of the other wall. So, it's critical to um, identify that, because this is a simple example shown here in the screen. There are other issues where you have projections, you have shafts, you have elevators enclosure exterior. So you have to deal with those. So the area bounded or included within the exterior walls, exclusive of vent shafts and courts, and these are the areas that are addressed in the allowable area. Now, areas of buildings that does not have surrounding exterior walls, they must be included in the building area also if it's under a horizontal projection of a floor or roof above. So if there's a projection of a floor above, like a pop out on the second floor, that area under that projection must be also included. But in general, it's the area bounded by the exterior walls, excluding vent shafts and courts. So if a court open to the sky, we don't include it. But if the court has a projection of a second story above it, then it must be included in the calculation of the actual area to compare with that factor on the table. And again, that factor in the table or the pure area is just per story, and it does not include any increases. However, when we get to the table, we're going to see the difference between sprinklered building, allowable area, and non-sprinkler building. And we can see, so the increase is already built in for that in that table for sprinklered building. So when we have two or more buildings, this is another requirement we need to, or actually it's a feature the code allows, permits architects and designers the option. If you have several buildings located on a lot, the code allows the architects two options. You can regulate them as separate buildings by assuming an imaginary property line between the buildings, or consider all buildings are one, provided the height of each building and the allowable area does not exceed what's permitted in the code. The provisions in Chapter 7 of exterior walls also must be addressed, and that will come in the Chapter 7 seminars. So when you have exterior wall protection needed, even though a building is on the same lot, they need to be addressed as well. So again, most design professionals miss this, don't take advantage of this feature, um, and don't understand it. I mean, as simple as single family dwelling with a detached garage. You can, do you actually do an imaginary property line between the single family dwelling and a garage, which is a U occupancy, and the single family is R3? You don't. You basically say it's one building and you regulate the type of construction, which is mostly type 5N, and the separation distance to the property line as required by the table we talked about, the 5 feet, less than 5 feet or more than 30 feet was the extremes of that table. So this is the table that regulates the building height. And in the footnotes, and we'll see the footnotes in the next chart, but I want to talk about it here because it's shown in the table. And I'm picking up the example of A occupancy and E occupancy. And you can see there is NS and there is S without area increase and S with area increase. And this gives us the building height in feet above the grade plane as defined in the code. So the first row of the A and E occupancy, NS stands for non-sprinklered. S stands for building equipped throughout with automatic sprinkler system, and as defined in Chapter 9, and there is 3 levels of sprinkler protection. There's 13 R's for residential buildings, there's 13D for dwellings, and there's the full-on sprinkler system. So for A and E, when we talk about sprinkler system, it will be sprinkler system installed accordance with section 903.3.1.1, which is full-on sprinkler system, or the best sprinkler system ever there is, that will require a sprinkler system of concealed spaces and everything else. Whereas 13R and 13D is less. That will be covered in the Chapter 9 webinar. So for A and E, if the building is non-sprinklered, and if it's type 1A, it's unlimited UL. Again, type 1A is permissive here. It allows you to go as high as you want, but it restricts you throughout the code in terms of other provisions. So that's what I say, the code gives and takes. So in this case, type 1A, it's unlimited. The building is non-sprinklered. You can go on unlimited height in height. Whereas if the building is type 5B, then your maximum height in feet is 40 feet. If it's type 5.1a, which basically will be 1 hour rating for the elements as we saw earlier, you can go up to 50 feet. And if it's type 1b, you're limited to 160 feet. Now let's stick with 1b. If it's 1b, you have 160 feet maximum height above the Great Plain. If you equip it with sprinkler system, then you can go up another 180 feet. But this is without area increase. But if you took advantage of the sprinkler system to increase your allowable area, you cannot double dip and you go back to the 160 as if the building is non-sprinklered. This is a fire marshal provision that made a change in the California Building Code. And the IBC, you don't see that. So again, I want to repeat this because it's very critical and it will explain why you see S without area increase and you see S with area increase. The fire marshal doesn't want you to double dip, to use the sprinklers to increase the building height by 20 feet and also to increase an allowable area. You can use one or the other. So that's why you have these two numbers. So again, type 1B, non-sprinklered, you can go up to 160 with the restrictions that the code impose on type 1B throughout. If you are not taking advantage of the sprinkler system to increase your area, you use your second line, which is S without area increase, you can go up to 180 feet. And if you use the area increase already, you cannot take advantage of it to increase the height of the building. So you revert back to the 160. And that goes out to all throughout the table. There are footnotes that we can talk about that doesn't, sometimes there is no difference, um, you know, um, for like hazardous occupancies. Whether you use sprinkler system, for if you look at 1B, without area increase or area increase, you're still limited to 160 for hazardous occupancies. So, but in general, for most occupancies, you cannot double dip, and it's only for state fire marshal occupancies. If you go to the first row, B, F, M, S, and U occupancy, business, factory, mercantile, storage, and utility, you see non-sprinklered, your type 1B 160, sprinklered type 1B is 180. You don't see sprinkler without area increase and sprinkler with area increase. One wonders why you don't see that. The reason you don't see that, because occupancy B, F, M, S, and U are not state fire marshal regulated occupancy. So they don't care about these occupancies. So you can double dip with B, F, M, S, and U. You can use a sprinkler to increase the height in here by 20 feet. And you can use the sprinkler system to increase your allowable area. Okay, I hope that's made clear. So we'll move on to the next slide. The next slide is a continuation of the table because the table is too large. And we look at the, basically looking at type 5B. And you can see here for group R2, for example, of type 5A construction, if it's sprinklered, the S area increase is permitted in addition to the height, which what I just said earlier in terms of the B, F, M, and U, and S. And here you can see in R2 13R, the sprinklers must be 13R. That's an FPA designation. And R1, you see above in the blue line, S13D versus S13R. So again, these allowable area increases for sprinkler increase, actually, I'm sorry, allowable height increases for sprinkler increase in the past used to be allowed manually. Now, and the code have them built into the table. So you really don't have to worry about applying them. You just go to the to the actual table. You pick the occupancy and type of construction. You, based on what we talked earlier, the fire protection provided, you make sure that the building does not exceed the permitted height. So for R3, non-sprinklered, type 1B, we have 160 feet, whereas type 5B non-rated is 40 feet, non-sprinklered. If we sprinkler it, we don't get an increase in height for, into 5B and 5A, but we get in type 13 using 13D, there is 60 feet, and there is footnotes that explain the non-sprinklered here. Footnote D, that we will see what that means shortly. I hope I'm listing it. But again, you have to make sure that you not only look at the occupancy at type construction, but you look at the fire protection feature, which we talked about in an early slide. This table talks about the building height and number of stories above the Great Plain, not in feet above the Great Plain. So there is the building height is measured by feet and also number of stories, and you have to check both. So, for example, in here for a B occupancy, which I highlighted, if the building is type 1A, it's immaterial. It's irrelevant. You're using very restrictive type of construction. There are requirements elsewhere in the code that makes you really penalize you by using this type of construction in terms of the restrictions, like stairwell pressurization system, exiting, type of construction elements. Everything has to be rated. The walls, the ceiling assemblies, the bearing walls, everything else. If it's non-sprinklered, it allows you to go unlimited height. For type 1B, the restrictions we talked about just now for type 1B is not the same as type 1A. The rating for the exterior walls, for example, is 2 hours versus type 1A is 3 hours. So the code limits you, takes away the unlimited height, but limits you to 11 feet. I'm sorry, 11 stories. Now, if it's sprinklered, occupancy classification of B sprinklered, then you get to go up to 12 stories in type 1B. So you can see now how that works. You're increasing the number of stories. And similarly, and, again, you're not allowed to double dip. And the requirement in the footnotes tells you that for occupancies regulated by a state fire marshal, you're not allowed to double dip. Now, mezzanines. Well, the mezzanines is defined in the code, and incidentally, every time you encounter a new term, I highly encourage you to go to section 202 in chapter 2 and review the definition. The definition will give you a lot of information, and it's listed off, every term is listed alphabetically. Mezzanine will be under M, you'll talk about it. So what is the advantage of mezzanine? The advantage of mezzanine is you can add additional area in the building, and mostly in warehouses and industrial buildings, and that is not included in the maximum area that you're allowed, which is the area from the table, including any increases you apply, whether it's sprinklers, frontage increases, and so forth. So it's not considered additional story, provided it meets the definition of a mezzanine. And we'll see the definition of a mezzanine shortly. But this is the advantages. Not considered as an additional story, not included in the building area. However, it's included in the fire control area when dealing with hazardous material. It is regulated in the exiting chapter as far as exiting from the mezzanine. The clear height above and below the mezzanine floor must not be less than 7 feet. So that's a requirement for it to become a legal mezzanine, to qualify it as a mezzanine. And it's really an immediate level above and below the floor or ceiling of a story of a warehouse. And we'll see the limitation. It must not exceed 1/3 the area of the room in which it's located. So here, this mezzanine, and you can see a door there and a stair, the area of that office must not exceed 1/3 of the room in which it's located. I apologize, let me go back. This is the mezzanine right here. The whole mezzanine, forget the office, and it's included in a space. The stair is interior. This area of this mezzanine on these posts must not exceed 1/3 of the main room itself of the warehouse. And it also must not be more than 7 feet above or below the height. So there are exceptions for walls that not exceeding 42 inches to allow for guardrail. So you can have a wall or a solid wall like a guardrail, and that's an exception. And posts and columns. So so that covers the mezzanine. We'll go back to how do we determine the whole building area? The building area is basically determined based on a variety of factors. We talked about the type of construction and the occupancy classification and other features, fire protection features. So we talked about whether or not there is a sprinkler system in the building. And if it's sprinklered in group R, what type of sprinkler system you're using? Are you using 13R or 13D? Incidentally, 13R or 13D is an FPA classification. They are listed in the code in Chapter 9 with section numbers and distinguishing the difference between the full-on sprinkler system, 13R and 13D, 13D being the least restrictive or least sprinkler system that has the least features. 13D has a little bit more, 13D is the one with the least features. 13R has less features between the full-on sprinkler system and the 13D. The amount of space frontage, we'll talk about that just now, and we'll see some examples, and the number of stories in the building. So when we determine the amount of pure area in table 506.2, which is called the allowable area factor. Now, how do we get to the whole building area? So basically, if the building is multi-story versus single story, then we can see how we can increase the area. And the area is limited. For 1 story, the increase is 2 times. For 3 stories or more, you increase it twice. And we'll see that in the tables. Also, if the building is single occupancy versus mixed occupancy, how do you handle a mixed occupancy building? Because we saw in the table, the allowable area factor is based on occupancy, A, B, and so forth. So if you have a building, mainly business occupancy, and you have an A occupancy, so you have mixed occupancies. So you pick an allowable area from the table for A, and you pick an allowable area for B. So how do you arrive at the overall allowable area of the building? So we'll talk about that just now. So this is the basis for determining the allowable area for the whole building once we picked up the pure factor and modified it, whether the frontage or sprinkler system or so forth. So here is the allowable area factors frontage, the allowable area factors that we pick for each occupancy, and then we'll make additions and modifications. So, so I'm picking B again for the purpose of comparison. So what is SM stands for? Well, we know NS is non-sprinklered. Now, S1 is buildings with a maximum of 1 story. And SM is a building with 2 or more stories above grade. So this table gives you the allowable area factor with the story increases already built in. So, and this, let's see, this screen highlight skipped a little bit. So let's take a look at B, occupancy. A B occupancy, non-sprinklered, Type 2A is the allowable area is 37,500 if it's non-sprinklered. If it's sprinklered one story, the allowable area is 150,000 square feet. If it's sprinklered with 2 stories or more, the allowable area is 112,500. So these factors are already built in. This does not include the frontage increase. Basically, this includes the story increase. So if it's 1 story, you get to increase the area 3 times. If it's 2 story or more, you get to increase it twice, the allowable area. The 150,000 for the B occupancy, sprinklered 1 story, type 2-1A, basically is the factor taken from that table, the pure area factor, modified by sprinkler system and number of stories. And of course, the fire marshal regulated occupancy, state regulated occupancy will show that you cannot increase, get a story increase. So the state fire marshal regulated occupancy in this table did not take advantage of the story or height increase. It's only taking advantage of the allowable area increase using sprinkler system and multi-story. So again, this table represents the pure area factor taken earlier from that table, and the allowable area increase for sprinkler and number of stories is already built in. So here we go. This is the occupancy. I just talked about this. And you can see the allowable area for the B occupancy. So now let's talk about the frontage increase. And this is the increase that the code allow you to use when you're basically to allow for fire department access and rescue. It's based on the percentage of the open perimeter of the building. There is no increase permitted where the perimeter is no more than 25% open. So if it's 25% open or less, you don't get an area increase. There's typically a maximum increase of 75% when the entire perimeter is open. So when the entire perimeter is open, you don't increase your allowable area by not more than 75%. That's the maximum limit. So if you see a building on a lot and there is open all around it, the bullet point that talks about the 20 feet and 30 feet, let's say it's 40 feet all around, and the allowable area, you can increase it by a factor of 1.75. So you multiply by 1.75, which is the 75% increase only. The open space must be at least 20 feet wide to be considered open and 30 feet maximum. The open space are to be accessed from a street or a fire lane. So this is the formula to allow you for the street frontage, and it's basically F over P minus 0.25, W over 30. And 30, again, is the maximum, the width of the opening. So we say it's 30 feet maximum because if the width is 30 and you divide 30 over 30, it becomes immaterial. F over P, F is the percentage of open space. P is the actual perimeter minus 0.25. This yields the maximum of 0.75 or 75% increase. The weight, the width of the open space, you can use the weighted average by multiplying the length of the building dimension times the width of that dimension and added, again, the dimension of the second dimension by the width of that available for the second dimension and so forth, and divide by the total amount of the building dimensions added together, so you get a weighted average of W. And here's an example here. Yards as shown is basically 40 feet. The width of the street is 40 feet. Determine percentage area increase of the building proposed. We have 70 feet, 15 feet, 50, 35, and so forth. So we'll go to the equations and calculate the frontage increase. So this is the equation F over P, 0.25 W over 30. F is the building perimeter with the width available more than 20 feet. So we basically, I'm going to go back, we ignore this width that has 15 feet. We cannot add that because that's less than 20. So that's why there's a difference between the actual building perimeter P and the actual building perimeter with the width available more than 20 termed F. So F 310 feet, P 460, W is 35, 70, and 90 with the weighted average. But we don't do the weighted average because it's maxed out at 30 anyway. So we divide 30 by 30, it's 1. And we divide 310 over 460 is 0.67 minus 0.25. So our frontage increase is 42% or 0.42. This is another example of the building. So I'm going to skip through that because we're getting short on time. But again, you can see here, we do the allowable area of the building. Let me go through this here. And this is the actual allowable area of the building. We multiply by the number of stories. So we get the square footage. It's a 3-story building. Let me go back to the assumption here. It's 4-story building. We're limited to 3 increase number of stories. So we got the factor 69,000 square feet from the table. We added the frontage increase based on this formula, which is 9,660.42 times 3. So we get the area per story times 3, which is the maximum story increase allowed. So the whole building is limited to 235,980 square feet. Unlimited area buildings, these are buildings that are specific type of buildings, specific occupancies, minimum width surrounding them is 60 feet, minimum open space. I'm going to skip through that. So these are unlimited area buildings. Mixed occupancies. So we'll talk about mixed occupancies. There's 3 types: accessory occupancies, non-separated occupancies, and separated occupancies. And the designer can choose which approach to use. So we're getting a little short on time, 8 minutes. I'm going to keep going. And for those of you who wants to stay, that's fine. I apologize. The material is extensive. So, and there is another option. Well, it's not an option, but it's a consideration. It's called incidental occupancies, and we'll talk about that in a minute too. So for accessory occupancies, the occupancy must be accessory to the major occupancy. So if you have, for example, a senior living facility and a special retail store that only serves or just serves that, like flowers, when you're visiting, you buy flowers or gifts for the senior that you're visiting, then that's considered accessory occupancies. Must be considered accessory occupancy. Or a small meeting room in a office building. It's accessory to the office building, the meeting room. For group H2, H3, H4, 5, and L, the laboratories, they must be separated. There's no consideration for accessory occupancies. For these group of occupancies, residential, they must be separated from accessory occupancies in accordance with 420. For group I2, I2.1, they also must be separated. For group I3 and vehicle sally ports, they must be also separated. So these are special requirements for the accessory occupancies. Now, again, the accessory occupancy, first of all, must be part or accessory to the main occupancy. The separation is not required between the main occupancy and this accessory occupancies by fire barriers when all these are satisfied. The accessory occupancies does not exceed 10% of area in which this is located. So it cannot be bigger than 10% of the main area where it's located. And also the accessory occupancy itself should not exceed that pure area, allowable area in table 506.2, or the tabular area for non-sprinklered building. So if you meet all these requirements, you do not need to separate the accessory occupancy from the main occupancy. So here's some examples. 40 sprinkled buildings, 4 stories above grade plane, type 2 construction, 75% frontage increase. So this is in the second story. You can see it blown to the right. There's a meeting room. The meeting room has an occupant load of 78. So it would be otherwise considered assembly occupancy and must be separated in general from the group B. However, the area is 1,170 square feet, less than 10%. The area does not exceed the tabular area. It is a meeting room accessory to the B. Therefore, we do not need to provide fire barriers to separate this accessory occupancy from the main occupancy. So the second approach is you have 2 occupancies, but you don't separate them. And how do you use this approach? You have to use this approach if by applying the most restrictive requirements, construction, height, type, and everything else, of any occupancy to both occupancies. So you have to use the lesser height of each occupancy to both. You have to use the less floor area, the most restrictive fire protection requirement, and so forth. You apply it to the whole entire building, then you're not required to separate the occupancies. So this is an unseparated occupancy. So for example, here we have a 3-story type 2B building, contains assembly, nightclub, a restaurant, contains offices, contains mercantile. The building is fully sprinklered, does not qualify for any frontage increase. So these are assumptions. Allowable area purposes, the building is 26,000 square feet for each story. The second story is 26,000 square feet. You can see the total of the third story and the first floor does not exceed 26,000 square feet. So does the building comply with non-separated occupancy method used to regulate the mixed occupancy condition? So does this building comply with these occupancies and the square footage and the building height? So group A2 occupancy, the allowable height is 3, so that checks. Group B, the allowable height is 4 stories, that checks. Group M, the allowable height is 3 story, that checks. The allowable area in square feet for A2 occupancy is 28,500, so that's good because we have 26,000 square feet. The building is fully sprinklered, and if it is provided with manual fire alarm throughout, it would comply as an unseparated occupancy buildings. So everything else checked. So we can qualify this building as non-separated occupancy, provided we apply the maximum of most restrictive height and allowable area as shown in this slide. Separated occupancies is you provide, if you have occupancies, you choose to provide separation, horizontal or vertical. And these are fire barriers in accordance with Chapter 7, in accordance with the table 50.4, which you will see shortly, what separation is needed. So here's an example, 1-story, 78,000 square feet building, fully sprinklered with 3 occupancy group, type 2B building, and adjoin 2 public ways that qualify for 25% sprinkler, 25% frontage increase. So does the building comply with the code using the separated occupancy approach? This is very critical, and you must really pay attention to this. So group A2, the allowable square footage from the table is 38,000. Frontage increase is 25%. So the allowable area is 40,375, similarly Group B and Group M. So now we determine the actual allowable area for each. So we divide the actual area, allowable area. So we divide the actual area of 6,000 square feet divided by the allowable area of Group A2. We divide the allowable area of Group B by the actual area, and we divide the allowable area by the actual area, and it must be less than 1. This is the unity equation. It's basically simple rational approach. So in this case, is it less than 1? It's not. Obviously 0.47 and 0.49 and 0.15 is more, it's 1.11. So the building does not comply as separated occupancy building. So if we go back to the example itself, this is type 2B, and it's already fully sprinklered, and it doesn't comply with the separated occupancy approach. We're using the unity equation. It's it actually exceeded the actual area, even with the increases, exceed the allowable area, even with the increases, exceeded the actual area because the ratio was more than 1. So what's the solution to this? You can choose to cut the building down, so the actual area would be less than the allowable area. You can choose to reduce the size, well, you cut the building down, relocate the building in a manner to get more frontage increases. Hopefully it will help you. And the other ultimate solution will be to go to a higher type of construction. And instead of type B, you may go to type 2A. So your allowable area factor will increase. And this way you can comply. So we covered this already. Incidental uses, these are identified in the code in a table we will see shortly. These are a use in a room or space, the extension of the primary use, and however, the risk is inconsistent with the main occupancy. For example, a boiler room, and we're going to see that. And in table 509, these are incidental uses, and they're required to be separated in most cases, unless, of course, you provide sprinkler system, then you do not need to provide fire rated separation. And here's the two methods, is either you provide a passive fire resistant separation, rated fire barriers or horizontal assemblies, and or both if it's located in a multi-story building, or you provide protection sprinkler system. So these are the incidental uses. You can see they're listed here. Furnace room, specifically the equipment is for over 400,000 BTU per hour, rooms with boilers and so forth. And you can see to the right, you either provide 1 hour or provide automatic sprinkler system. And these incidental uses basically will become part of the main occupancy. And you know, and rationally, if you think about it, if you don't provide sprinkler system, you're providing separation, 1 hour separation, and just like occupancy separation in most cases. So these are the incidental uses. So again, based on the table 509, you provide the separation. We talked about that, and usually allow use sprinkler system in lieu of the passive separation. This is the fire resistant separation required by table 509, and it will be covered extensively in chapter 7 webinar. You either provide fire barriers or horizontal assembly, and typically it's 1 hour rating. We can see graphically here, a fire barrier must go all the way up to the under floor or ceiling assembly above, and it must be continuous through the concealed space. Again, section 711, chapter 7, we'll talk about that in detail. Sometimes, like I said earlier, you can provide sprinkler system, and then the incidental use does not have to be separated. This is the smoke resistant separation in here. So doors must be self-closing, and no air transfer opening, and the walls can extend to the point where the floor ceiling assembly stops. So it doesn't have to go all the way up to the floor or roof deck through the concealed space. This is for smoke separation. There are special provisions in the code related to occupancy separations that allows, for example, a 3-hour separation of podium construction for apartment over subterranean parking, garage, and so forth. So these are special provisions related to the occupancy separation. You may want to review them yourself. We're running out of time. Um, just lastly, I'll talk about control area. The purpose of the control area is to basically uh, provide, permit the hazardous occupancy that exceeds the maximum MAQs, maximum allowable quantities in the code, to be housed in that control area. So they'll be controlled. And this way, you will limit the hazard. Another question, how must individual dwelling units be separated from other areas in an apartment building? And this has nothing to do with occupancy separation. It's a special detailed requirement in section 420. Dwelling units must be separated from each other and from other occupancies through the use of fire partition or horizontal assemblies. We all know this is 1 hour separation required. So that concludes the presentation. I appreciate your patience. I'll go to the Q&A and see if there is any Q&A. There is some. Um, um, let's see. Do you have an example of how the allowable area? There's a question here. See that. I have two questions. One is by Eric Wong asking for annotation. I tried that and that didn't work. So maybe hopefully we'll try to master that. Do you have an example? This is a question. Do you have an example of how the allowable area for mixed occupancy building is calculated using the aggregate sum of each occupancy? We covered that using the unity equation. Basically, you divide the allowable area by the actual area, and you added allowable area by actual area. If you have one occupancy, the allowable area divided, you don't have to divide the allowable area by the actual area. You compare them straightforward. The allowable area, the actual area must be less than the allowable area. But when you have mixed occupancies, you use the unity equation, and the total of the division must be less than 1. I have another question for 503.1.2. We would use the most restrictive occupancy group and construction type to calculate the aggregate building area. And the answer is yes. That's for non-separated occupancy. You would use the most restrictive type. Let's see, I have another question that just popped in. Can you please go over maximum allowable area for R2 with area increases and without area increases in table 506.2? Let me go back and see if I can pull it up. Okay, so I don't have that shown in the table, unfortunately. So I can't share the table. It's not included in the presentation. But let's take a look at the height and see if R2 is shown. We have the height. All right, well, again, I apologize for lack of time. We got short on time. I can't see the questions anymore for some reason. So I appreciate your attention and thank you very much for sharing your morning with me. And I hope you will benefit from the 2 hours we spent together. Thank you again and enjoy the rest of your day.
Okay, thank you very much, Jay, for a very informative webinar. I would also like to thank each and every one of our participants for joining us today. For the last question, I'll email that to Jay. And the question is there any separation required between open parking garage S2 and gym A3? So I'm gonna forward that to Jay and hopefully he'll get back to you. Well, he'll get back to me and I'll forward that to you guys. Thank you. Have a good day.
Maria, can
Yes.
you send the R2 question to, I couldn't answer that also.
Oh,
The
okay.
R2 library. Yeah, and I'll
Okay.
respond to that. Thank you very much.
All right. I'll email it to you, Jay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, everyone.